In March of 2023, protests erupted in Georgia. What caused them? What was the outcome? And what can Armenia learn from it? The Georgian parliament backed a draft law that would require NGOs and media outlets that receive more than 20% of their funding from abroad to register as agents of foreign influence and disclose their sources of income. The government claimed that the law was inspired by a similar American law from 1938 and that it aimed to increase transparency and accountability. You might be thinking that all sounds pretty innocent and well-intentioned. However, the Georgian opposition, civil society, and international organizations were quick to denounce the law as a copy of a Russian law from 2012 that was used to stifle independent voices and civil society in Russia. But do these allegations have any merit? The Russian 2012 law was used to label NGOs and media outlets that received funding from abroad and engaged in political activity as, quote, foreign agents. This meant that they had to register with the Ministry of Justice, disclose their sources of income, submit to frequent audits and inspections, and mark all their publications with a disclaimer that they were distributed by a foreign agent. The law was widely seen as a tool to suppress civil society and press freedom in Russia, especially groups that opposed or criticized Vladimir Putin and his policies. The law also created a negative stigma and a hostile environment for those who were designated as foreign agents, as the term foreign agents had strong associations with espionage and treason. Many NGOs and media outlets faced harassment, intimidation, fines, lawsuits, raids, vandalism, and violence from the authorities and pro-government groups. Some were forced to close down or suspend their operations due to pressure and restrictions. Since 2012, the scope of the law has been progressively expanded to include not only NGOs and media organizations, but also private individuals or groups who receive any amount of foreign funding and publish or share any information on public issues. This means that anyone who receives money from abroad and expresses a political opinion can now be labeled as a foreign agent and subjected to the same regulations and sanctions as NGOs and media outlets. The law has also been used to target journalists, bloggers, activists, lawyers, academics, artists, celebrities, and ordinary citizens who have voiced dissenting views or exposed corruption, human rights violations, or other problems in Russia. Here are a few examples of NGOs that were persecuted as foreign agents under this law. Memorial, a distinguished human rights group that documents abuses and historical repression. The Anti-Corruption Foundation, led by opposition leader Alexei Navalny. Golos, an independent election monitor. Transparency International Russia, an anti-corruption watchdog. Levada Center, a Russian independent polling agency. With all that in mind, it becomes understandable why Georgians could argue that such a law would undermine Georgia's democracy, sovereignty, and European integration. So what was the sequence of events that followed? On the 6th of March, the Georgian parliament gave preliminary approval to the draft law on transparency and foreign influence. On the 7th of March, thousands of protesters gathered in Tbilisi and other cities to denounce the draft law and demand its withdrawal. They also called for early parliamentary elections and the release of political prisoners, including the former president. The protesters were met with police violence, tear gas, and water cannons. On the 8th of March, the protests continue for the second day, with more clashes between the police and the demonstrators. The Georgian president, who was on an official visit to the United States, issued a video statement condemning the draft law and urging the parliament to retract it. She also accused the ruling Georgian Dream Party of being influenced by Russia and betraying Georgia's pro-Western aspirations. On the 9th of March, the protests escalated into a nationwide strike, with workers, students, teachers, and civil servants joining the demonstrations. The opposition parties announced a boycott of the parliament and called for an international mediation. The European Union, the United States, and other Western countries expressed their concern over the draft law and the violence against the protesters. They urged the Georgian government to respect democratic principles and human rights. Let me just quickly interject here to say how great the US and European Union are to speak out about democratic principles and human rights. Moving forward, we can expect them to hold those same values when it comes to other players in the region. Unless, of course, they're hypocrites. Anyway, on the 10th of March, under mounting pressure from within and outside the country, the Georgian parliament retracted the draft law on foreign agents. So, what can Armenia learn from all this? First, it can be a reminder to Armenia that civil society is a vital force for democracy and accountability, and that any attempts to undermine it will face strong resistance from the public. Armenia has a vibrant civil society sector that played a key role in the 2018 Velvet Revolution that ousted the former corrupt regime. But regardless of who is in power, Armenia should protect and support its civil society organizations, especially those that work on human rights, anti-corruption, and media freedom, as they are essential for ensuring checks and balances and advancing reforms. Second, Armenia can learn that foreign influence is not necessarily a bad thing, as long as it is transparent and aligned with the country's interests and values. Georgia has benefited from its close ties with the European Union and the United States, which have provided financial assistance, political support, and security guarantees. Georgia's aspirations to join the European Union has also motivated it to adopt democratic standards and reforms. Armenia has a more complex relationship with both Russia and the West, but should not shy away from engaging with its international partners and seeking their cooperation on issues of mutual concern. Armenia should also make sure that its foreign policy is based on its own national interests and not on external pressures or agendas. Finally, Armenia can learn that democracy is not a one-time event, but a continuous process that requires constant vigilance and participation. Georgia's democratic transition has been marred by setbacks such as political polarization, judicial interference, electoral fraud, and oligarchic influence. Despite all that, the 2023 protests show that the Georgian people are not willing to tolerate these problems and demand better governance and representations from their leaders. Armenia, which also faces similar challenges in its democratic consolidation, should heed this lesson and ensure that its institutions are responsive, inclusive, and accountable to the people while fostering a culture of dialogue and compromise among its political forces to avoid violence or radicalization.